I think the one I enjoyed reading more than anything else.
The palace did not tremble because something was stolen. It trembled because something was finally opened, and once opened, it could never be unseen. The safe. The first call came just after dawn, when the corridors were still quiet and the palace air held that particular winter stillness that always arrives before trouble. It was not a panicked call. It never is. Panic belongs to outsiders. Inside the institution, there is only control, or the sudden realization that control is slipping. The safe was not meant to be accessed that morning. It sat behind a paneled wall in a private sitting room that few staff were permitted to enter without notice. It was not listed on inventories shared with household officials. It was not part of the usual rotation of security checks. It existed in a category reserved for things that were never expected to become relevant again, until it did. The official explanation, brief and deliberately dull, would later describe a routine reassessment of secure holdings, a mechanical issue, a necessary override. What it would not say is that 3 senior aides froze the moment the door swung open, not because of what they feared might be inside, but because of how deliberately it had been arranged. This was not a storage space, it was an archive. Documents were stacked, not scattered. Envelopes were labeled in handwriting that had not changed in decades. Items that should never have been preserved had been preserved with care. There was no chaos here. No sign of emotional hoarding. Everything suggested intention. Within minutes, phones were silent. Messages were sent through intermediaries. One aide left the room and did not return. Another closed the door and stood with their back against it, as if the contents themselves might attempt escape. By mid-morning, the word tremble had begun circulating, not spoken aloud but understood. The kind of tremble that does not shatter windows, but destabilizes foundations. The kind that forces an institution to ask whether something long buried had been buried for protection or for leverage. No announcement was made, no meeting was scheduled. And yet, by nightfall, the balance inside the palace had shifted, because whatever had been found in that safe did not merely belong to the past, it implicated the present, and it threatened the future. What the palace already knew. Long before the safe was opened, the palace had been living with a quiet understanding that something was unresolved. Institutions like this do not rely on surprise, they rely on pattern recognition. And for months, arguably years, those patterns had been shifting in subtle but unmistakable ways. What outsiders often misunderstand is that the most dangerous tensions inside the royal household are never loud. They do not announce themselves through confrontation or public fracture. They accumulate instead through hesitation, through pauses in conversations that once flowed freely, through decisions deferred without explanation. By the time something surfaces, it has usually been rehearsed internally a dozen times in silence. There had been signs. Not warnings exactly, but pressure points. Requests for documentation that were redirected rather than refused. Personal correspondence handled outside normal archival channels. A noticeable narrowing of who was permitted access to certain rooms, certain files, certain conversations. None of it breached protocol outright. But it strained it. At the center of those strains sat Queen Camilla, a figure whose survival within the institution had always depended on acute awareness of how history can be weaponized. She had learned early that the palace does not forget, and that it forgives only when forgetting becomes inconvenient. Those closest to her understood that her approach to memory was not sentimental, it was strategic. She had lived through eras in which official narratives shifted quietly overnight, where yesterday's certainty became today's embarrassment. And she had seen, more than once, how the absence of records left individuals exposed when institutional priorities changed. That awareness shaped behavior. Over the past year, aides had noted a tightening of personal control. Not paranoia, precision. Items that once would have been entrusted to shared systems were instead retained privately. Conversations that might have been summarized for records were left undocumented. When asked, the explanations were always reasonable. Efficiency, privacy, discretion. No one could object without sounding accusatory. But beneath the professionalism, unease grew, because discretion is only neutral until it becomes selective, and selectivity implies intention. Privately, senior advisors debated whether the tension stemmed from fear or foresight. Some believed it was defensive, a natural instinct in an institution entering a period of vulnerability marked by health concerns, generational transition, and increasing public skepticism. Others suspected something more deliberate, that contingency planning had expanded beyond the institution itself. There had also been moments, small, easily dismissed moments, when history appeared to diverge depending on who was recounting it. A meeting remembered differently. A decision attributed to consensus that, upon closer examination, had been anything but. These discrepancies never reached the surface, but they circulated internally like cold air through old stone corridors. The palace is trained to tolerate contradiction. What it cannot tolerate is accumulation. By early autumn, a consensus had quietly formed among a small circle of senior officials. If private archives existed, they would eventually matter, not because of scandal, but because of timing. Institutions are most vulnerable not when secrets exist, but when authority shifts, and those secrets change hands. And authority was shifting. Health briefings had grown more carefully worded. Responsibilities were redistributed with greater frequency. The language of continuity was being used more often than usual, a sure sign that continuity was no longer assumed. In such moments, every record becomes a potential lever. Still, no one acted. Acting would require proof. And proof, inconveniently, was precisely what might be contained in spaces no one officially acknowledged. The palace had learned, through painful experience, that confronting a perceived threat too early can create the very crisis one hopes to avoid. Better to watch, better to prepare. Better to ensure that, if something surfaced, it would be met with structure rather than reaction. So when the safe was finally opened, the prevailing emotion was not shock, it was recognition. The discovery did not feel like the arrival of something new. It felt like the confirmation of something long suspected but deliberately unspoken. The tension that followed was not about surprise, but about scale, about realizing that the breadth of what had been preserved exceeded even the most cautious estimates. This was not a personal collection in the casual sense. It was a parallel memory, a record that existed alongside the official one, neither openly defiant nor fully aligned. That duality explained much of the unease that had preceded the moment. Why certain decisions had felt unusually constrained. Why certain narratives had been protected beyond necessity. Why silence had sometimes been chosen over clarity. In hindsight, the palace understood that it had been negotiating with an unseen variable for years. The safe was merely the physical manifestation of that variable, a reminder that power does not always announce itself through action. Sometimes, it waits patiently in storage, preserved against a future it anticipates but does not yet name. What troubled officials most was not that the materials existed, but that they suggested foresight. That someone had been thinking several steps ahead of the institution itself, that the past had been curated not for nostalgia, but for relevance. And once that realization set in, the discovery could no longer be framed as an isolated incident. It became part of a longer story. One the palace had, in some ways, already been living, without fully acknowledging it. The contents. The first rule imposed on those granted access to the materials was silence. Not the symbolic kind, the practical kind. No notes taken outside the room, no summaries drafted. No discussions held beyond a narrowly defined circle. Even reactions were expected to remain internal, managed, contained. The palace understood instinctively that the greatest risk was not what the documents said, but how people responded to them. And people did respond, not with shock, but with stillness. The room itself seemed to change once the review began. Conversations slowed. Chairs remained occupied long after pages had been read. No one rushed to conclusions. Instead, there was careful sequencing, an unspoken agreement that whatever this was, it needed to be approached sideways rather than head-on. One senior aide, normally brisk and procedural, stopped midway through a folder and closed it without comment. Another reread the same paragraph 3 times, not because it was confusing, but because it quietly contradicted something they had always accepted as settled history. A third asked, almost absent-mindedly, for confirmation of a date, then did not ask a follow-up question when it was provided. These were not reactions to scandal, they were reactions to destabilization. What emerged through those responses was not a single explosive revelation, but a pattern of preservation. Items that, individually, might have seemed inconsequential took on weight through proximity. Letters were placed beside notes, notes beside drafts, drafts beside timelines that had never entered the official archive. The effect was cumulative, not dramatic. There were moments of visible discomfort, not because lines had been crossed, but because boundaries had been anticipated. Some documents suggested that alternative outcomes had been quietly mapped long before events forced public decisions. Others revealed a degree of awareness about internal fractures that had been publicly denied at the time. No one said the word motive aloud, but it hung in the room. Several reviewers remarked later, privately, that the most unsettling aspect was the tone. The materials were not emotional. They were not vindictive. They carried no sense of grievance. If anything, they were calm, observational, almost detached. That calmness suggested something far more deliberate than reaction. One aide described it as reading the palace through a mirror held just slightly out of alignment. Health references, for example, appeared not as dramatic disclosures, but as footnotes. Brief mentions of severity discussed internally, but softened externally. Phrases like, "more complicated than publicly advisable," or "requires longer-term contingency," appeared without emphasis. No accusations, just acknowledgement. Others noticed references to conversations that, officially, had never occurred in that form. Decisions that had been framed as unanimous were shown to have involved hesitation. Moments described publicly as spontaneous were revealed to have been rehearsed across weeks. None of this was shocking to seasoned officials, but seeing it preserved changed its weight. Preservation implies expectation. At one point, a legal advisor paused the review and asked whether a particular envelope had been logged elsewhere. When told it had not, they did not press further. Instead, they adjusted their posture, as if recalibrating how much the room itself could safely contain. Another reviewer focused less on what was written and more on what was absent. Certain names appeared repeatedly, always neutrally, never critically. Others were conspicuously missing, despite their known involvement in the periods referenced. That absence spoke as loudly as inclusion. It suggested selectivity, not driven by emotion, but by relevance. By the third session, it became clear that the materials were not meant to tell a story on their own. They were meant to corroborate one, to exist as reinforcement rather than narrative. A safety net, not a manifesto. This realization shifted the tone of the room. If the archive had been a confession, it could be dismissed as personal. If it had been accusatory, it could be contained as grievance. But this was neither. It was quiet, structured, and patient. It assumed a future reader who already knew the outlines of events and needed only confirmation. That reader, the palace realized uneasily, might not be internal. The name Queen Camilla was never emphasized within the materials. It did not need to be. Her presence was felt instead through consistency, the same handwriting, the same phrasing, the same habit of annotating margins with questions rather than conclusions. It suggested a mind less interested in winning arguments than in surviving outcomes. Reactions to this varied sharply. Some interpreted it as prudence bordering on self-protection. Others saw it as a quiet challenge to institutional primacy, the idea that memory itself could be privately curated rather than centrally controlled. A few, more charitable, viewed it as an inevitable adaptation by someone who had learned that official memory is not always loyal. What none could deny was that the archive revealed awareness. Awareness of how quickly favor can shift, awareness of how narratives are constructed, awareness that silence, when paired with documentation, can be more powerful than speech. By the end of the review period, No one asked anymore what exactly had been found. That question had become irrelevant. The real concern was interpretive. How would these materials be understood if ever detached from context? How easily could they be reframed? How selectively could they be deployed? Because power does not require full disclosure. It requires leverage. And leverage, the palace understood now, does not need to be used to exist. The contents of the safe did not accuse anyone. They did not demand action. They simply sat there, orderly, patient, and quietly destabilizing. They challenged not the legality of past decisions, but the mythology surrounding them. They suggested that inevitability had been rehearsed, and that outcomes had been anticipated long before they were accepted. When the final folder was closed, no one spoke for several minutes. There was nothing left to add. The materials had done what they were meant to do, not through revelation, but through implication. The palace did not leave that room with answers. It left with a new understanding of how carefully the past had been held, and why the future suddenly felt less certain, the lines that cannot be crossed. By the time the internal debates formally began, the palace had already accepted one uncomfortable truth. There was no neutral response available. Every possible course of action carried consequence. Every delay was, in itself, a decision, and every decision risked exposing not just an individual, but the institution's unspoken rules about loyalty and survival. The earliest discussions were deliberately technical. Advisors framed the issue as one of protocol, access, and precedent. Who had the authority to retain private archives? Under what circumstances could personal records intersect with institutional memory? Could containment be justified without acknowledgement? These questions provided a useful buffer, allowing participants to speak without addressing the deeper anxiety that sat beneath them. But technical language can only hold for so long. Soon the conversation shifted, not abruptly but inevitably, toward motive, implication, and trust. Toward whether the existence of the archive represented prudence or quiet defiance, toward whether loyalty to the crown could coexist with contingency planning that appeared to anticipate institutional fracture. Some senior figures argued that the materials, however unsettling, crossed no explicit line. They pointed out that private records have always existed alongside official ones. That survival within the royal system has often required individuals to protect themselves against historical revision. From this perspective, the archive was not a threat, but a symptom, evidence of how precarious personal standing can be within an institution that prizes continuity over individual memory. Others were less forgiving. They warned that allowing such parallel records to exist unchallenged undermined the very premise of centralized authority. The monarchy, they argued, survives not on transparency, but on coherence. Multiple versions of the same past, especially preserved with intent, risk fracturing that coherence. Today's private safeguard could become tomorrow's bargaining chip. What unsettled this group most was not what had been kept, but how carefully it had been framed. There was no chaos to discredit, no emotional excess to dismiss. The archive was restrained, factual, and above all, credible. That credibility made it dangerous. At the center of these debates hovered a question no one wanted to voice directly. What did this mean for the balance of power? Queen Camilla had long been perceived as someone who understood the limits of her position with surgical clarity. She had survived precisely by not testing those limits publicly. And yet, the existence of the archive suggested an awareness that limits are not static, that they shift with health, succession, and public tolerance. Some advisors interpreted this as realism. Others saw it as a quiet challenge. The discussions grew more charged when the matter of consequence was raised. If the palace chose to act formally, restricting, absorbing, or neutralizing the materials, what precedent would that set? Would it signal strength or insecurity? And if no action were taken, what message would that send about the institution's ability to regulate its own memory? There were also questions of loyalty that proved harder to define than expected. Loyalty to whom? To the individual? To the role? to the abstraction of the crown itself? Several advisors noted that the monarchy has historically survived not because of unwavering loyalty, but because of negotiated allegiance. Lines have always existed, they are simply rarely discussed. This discovery forced those lines into the open. One senior figure argued that survival depends on allowing certain ambiguities to remain unresolved, that forcing clarity where none is required can accelerate fracture. Another countered that ambiguity is only tolerable when it remains unseen. Once acknowledged, it must be addressed, or it metastasizes. The most sobering contributions came from those tasked with thinking beyond the immediate moment. They spoke not of reaction but of legacy, of how this episode would be remembered internally, even if never publicly known, of how future figures would interpret the palace's response when deciding how much of themselves to entrust to the institution, because every response teaches a lesson. By the end of the debate's second day, it was clear that consensus would not be achieved. Instead, a narrower objective emerged: identify the lines that could not be crossed, regardless of interpretation. Those lines were never written down, but they understood. The materials would not be destroyed. Destruction implies guilt. They would not be publicly acknowledged. Acknowledgement invites reinterpretation. They would not be quietly absorbed into official archives. Absorption implies endorsement. Instead, the palace chose the path it knows best: controlled stasis. The archive would remain contained, its existence known only to those who needed to know. Access would be limited. References would be avoided. The matter would be neither resolved nor escalated. This decision satisfied no one entirely. Those who favored action saw it as weakness. Those who favored restraint saw it as barely sufficient. And yet, it aligned with the institution's oldest instinct: survive first, explain later, if at all. What lingered after the debates was not relief, but recalibration, a recognition that loyalty within the palace is not binary. It is conditional, contextual, and often negotiated in silence. The archive had forced that truth into the open. And in doing so, it reminded everyone involved that the most dangerous lines are not the ones written into protocol. They are the ones everyone knows exist and pretends never to approach. Camilla's silence. Silence, inside the palace, is never empty. It is weighted, calibrated, and often more revealing than speech. In the days that followed the internal debates, the absence of response from Queen Camilla became its own presence, felt in corridors, noted in briefings, and quietly measured against every previous crisis she had endured. She did not ask to see the materials again. She did not summon advisors to explain or contextualize what had been found. There were no late-night meetings, no urgent calls, no visible attempts to reassert control. Her schedule remained unchanged. Engagements were attended. Correspondence was handled. Routine, that most potent of royal tools, was maintained with near-perfect consistency. To those who did not know her well, the composure suggested detachment. To those who did, it signaled restraint. Camilla had learned long ago that emotional display inside the institution is rarely interpreted as sincerity. It is interpreted as weakness, or worse, as liability. Survival had taught her to internalize reaction and externalize stability. Silence, for her, was not avoidance, it was containment. Privately, aides noted a narrowing of her circle. Conversations became shorter, more precise. Casual confidences were replaced with neutral acknowledgments. She listened more than she spoke, and when she did speak, it was never about the matter at hand. That omission was not accidental. It was a refusal to frame the issue in a way that others could later reinterpret. Isolation followed naturally, not imposed, but accepted. There is a particular kind of isolation that comes from being fully present yet emotionally unreachable. Camilla inhabited that space with practiced ease. She understood that any overt attempt to justify herself would invite scrutiny not only of the archive, but of her motives, her history, and her role within an institution that has always struggled to reconcile personal survival with collective mythology. Her silence forced others to fill the void. Some interpreted it as confidence. Others are calculations. A few wondered whether it was resignation. None could say for certain, and that uncertainty was precisely its power. In the absence of explanation, speculation had no anchor. Psychologically, the restraint was not effortless. Those close to her observed moments of withdrawal, of stillness that lingered longer than usual. Time spent alone increased. The familiar rituals of reflection, walking, reading, writing, took on greater prominence. She was not disengaging. She was processing. Camilla had always understood that memory is a battleground, that those who do not curate their own past risk having it curated for them. The archive had been an extension of that understanding, not an act of defiance. But she also knew that intention rarely survives interpretation. Once something is discovered, it ceases to belong solely to the person who preserved it. That knowledge informed her restraint. To speak would be to concede that explanation was owed. To defend would be to imply accusation. To emote would be to invite judgment. Silence allowed none of those narratives to fully form. It kept the matter suspended, unresolved, and therefore manageable. Emotionally, this required discipline bordering on severity. Camilla was no stranger to scrutiny, but this was different. This was internal. The judgment came not from tabloids or public opinion, but from within the institution she had spent decades learning how to navigate. That kind of scrutiny cuts deeper because it is conducted by those who understand the rules. And yet, she did not flinch. Those who expected contrition did not receive it. Those who anticipated confrontation were disappointed. What they encountered instead was a woman who understood that the palace's greatest vulnerability is reaction. By offering none, she denied it momentum. There was also, beneath the restraint, a recognition of limits. Camilla was acutely aware that her position existed within boundaries that could tighten without warning. Health concerns, succession dynamics, and public tolerance all shaped the margins of her influence. The archive had not been an attempt to exceed those margins, but to prepare for their contraction. Silence, in this context, was an acknowledgement of reality. It was also an act of self-preservation. The emotional cost of that preservation was borne privately. There were no confidants to whom she unburdened herself fully, no recorded reflections that would later surface. The very instinct that had led her to preserve selectively now guided her inward. She trusted process over catharsis, patience over persuasion. In the weeks that followed, the palace noted a subtle shift, not in her behavior, but in how others behaved around her. Conversations became more formal. Assumptions were checked more carefully. The silence had recalibrated the room. It reminded everyone that she was not merely reacting to events, but enduring them. And endurance, within the monarchy, has always been a form of power. Camilla's silence did not resolve the questions raised by the archive. It did not neutralize the implications or soften the unease. But it did something perhaps more consequential. It demonstrated that she would not be drawn into a narrative she did not control. In a palace that thrives on managed stories, that refusal was its own statement. Quiet, calculated, unyielding, and impossible to ignore. What happens after a palace trembles? The palace did not announce an ending because there was none to announce. What followed the discovery was not resolution in any conventional sense, but adjustment, quiet, deliberate, and almost imperceptible to those who were not trained to notice such shifts. Institutions like this do not heal by confrontation, they heal by recalibration. Outwardly, nothing appeared to change. Engagements continued. Statements followed familiar phrasing. The rhythm of royal life resumed with practiced normalcy. But inside the system, small alterations accumulated, each one subtle enough to escape attention on its own, yet significant in totality. Access protocols were reviewed under the language of modernization. Archival procedures were clarified, a word that suggested efficiency rather than concern. Lines of reporting were tightened. Redundancies were removed. The effect was not punitive but corrective, an institutional instinct to reduce ambiguity wherever it had recently proven uncomfortable. No reference was made to the safe. None was necessary. The materials themselves remained sealed, neither absorbed nor erased. Their containment became symbolic of the palace's chosen response: acknowledge internally, neutralize procedurally, and move forward without spectacle. This was not avoidance, it was prioritization. The monarchy has always understood that survival depends less on moral certainty than on structural continuity. What changed most was not policy, but posture. Senior advisors became more cautious about assumptions. Where once informal understandings had sufficed, documentation was now preferred. Where discretion had been trusted, verification was quietly reinstated. These were not reactions born of fear, but of recognition. The palace had been reminded that memory itself can become a variable, and variables must be managed. For some, this recalibration felt like a loss. The informal loyalties that once smoothed decision-making were replaced with distance. Conversations grew more guarded. The ease of shared understanding gave way to something more procedural, more brittle. Yet others saw it as necessary, a return to fundamentals after a period of emotional complexity. At the center of this recalibration stood Queen Camilla, unchanged in role, unchanged in visibility, but subtly repositioned within the internal ecosystem. Not diminished, not elevated, redefined. Her silence had done its work. By refusing to engage publicly or privately with the controversy, she had allowed the institution to frame its response as structural rather than personal. This protected not only her position, but the monarchy's broader narrative. No individual was isolated as a problem. No moral judgment was rendered. The issue became one of systems, not people. This distinction mattered. The monarchy has survived precisely because it understands when to personalize crisis and when to abstract it. Scandals consume individuals. Recalibrations preserve institutions. In choosing the latter, the palace reaffirmed its oldest instinct. Yet the absence of closure carried its own cost. Unanswered questions lingered in the minds of those who had seen the materials. Interpretations remained unresolved. Trust, once complicated, does not automatically restore itself. It adapts, often into something more conditional. The palace accepted this as the price of containment. There was also an unspoken understanding that something fundamental had shifted. The illusion that all meaningful memory resides within official archives had been quietly dismantled. The institution now knew with certainty that parallel records could exist, and that their mere existence alters the balance of power. This knowledge could not be undone. In the months that followed, advisors noted a change in how future risks were discussed. Less confidence in inevitability, more emphasis on scenario planning. The language of permanence softened, replaced by phrases that acknowledged uncertainty without naming it outright. This was not pessimism. It was an adaptation. History, the palace had been reminded, is not a single narrative. It is a negotiation. What never happened was perhaps most telling. There was no leak, no strategic disclosure, no attempt to weaponize the archive from within or without. This absence reinforced the palace's decision. Had the materials surfaced publicly, the recalibration might have appeared naive, but silence held. Not because of fear, but because the stakes were understood by everyone involved. Silence, in this case, became collective. The monarchy emerged intact, but subtly altered, less confident in its invisibility, more aware of its internal fractures. This did not weaken it. If anything, it hardened it. Institutions that survive long enough learn that denial is more dangerous than acknowledgement, even when acknowledgement remains private. For Queen Camilla, the outcome was neither vindication nor condemnation. It was continuation. Her role remained defined by restraint, by an ability to endure scrutiny without absorbing it. The archive had not been erased, but neither had it been activated. Its purpose, whatever it had been intended to serve, remained dormant, and perhaps that was the final recalibration. The palace did not tremble again, but it remembered that it had trembled once, and that memory now shaped every quiet decision that followed. Because when an institution realizes that its foundations can move, it does not rebuild them in public. it reinforces them in silence. In quiet moments, some inside the palace reflected on what had truly unsettled them. It was not the existence of private memory, nor even the suggestion of parallel narratives. It was the realization that foresight had existed where the institution preferred to believe in instinct. That preparation had occurred beyond sanctioned channels. That survival, once assumed to be collective, had briefly become individual. This recognition lingered long after procedures were tightened and conversations normalized. It introduced a new humility into decision-making, a subtle awareness that authority is most fragile when it believes itself unquestioned. That loyalty, while deeply valued, is never unconditional. And that endurance often belongs to those who understand when not to speak. The palace moved forward with care, aware now that every recalibration becomes part of the next generation's inheritance. What had happened would not be taught, referenced, or formally remembered. But it would be felt, in caution, in hesitation, in the quiet preference for structure over assumption. In that way, the Tremble achieved what no scandal ever could. It sharpened the institution's self-awareness, not through exposure, but through restraint. And inside a monarchy built on centuries of silence, that may have been the most enduring consequence of all. What was uncovered never became a headline, yet it reshaped everything behind closed doors. The palace endured, but it did not forget. And perhaps that is how power truly survives, by absorbing the shock in silence. If you want deeper insight into the stories the palace never confirms, subscribe now, like this video, and share your thoughts below. The next revelation may already be waiting.